This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I, and Daria, are going to talk about traveling chapters. Now, traveling is not so much a literary term as a word. I made a literary term. So I think if you've read my Storyworks Guide to Writing Character, you know what I'm talking about. I've also got some writing tips on it, but basically it's when you need to travel your character from point A to point B. And it's important you get your reader from point A to point B as well. So it might be actual physical travel through space in the world of your story, but more often it's intellectual travel. Your character needs to discover something factual in order to help him get further into the plot of your story. So if you think of detectives doing legwork, the door knocking, the reading through files and paperwork and taking stuff to labs, that's a classic example, but you find this in all genres. It's not just detective stories. And it's problematic because writers often focus on their plot. What do I need my character to do in this scene or in this chapter? And so they write that. But that alone is not enough to support a chapter. It's not interesting enough to carry the reader deeper into the story. That's where your reader is likely to start yawning and put the book away. So we're going to talk about traveling chapters and how to make them do more than travel between point A and point B. Is this something you two have encountered in your writing and or reading?
Yeah, for sure. Both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think in the early days as a writer, probably most of us do it anyway, because you're thinking, well, I'm writing a story and it's a story about this character and it's what the character's doing. And it isn't until you realize that what they're doing has to further the story, everything that they do has to further the story in some meaningful fashion and not just show how they went shopping that day. I think it's a common mistake, and it's pretty easy to pick up in revisions. And then once you sort of see the repetitive pattern of it, or if you do a fairly decent amount of study in storycraft and understand that every scene must have some point to it, whether you describe it as turning or whether you describe it as having a climax or a crisis or a conflict or some new thing that advances the story, then I think it's fairly easy to get rid of. But then still you end up with that problem of, I need to get from A to B, and is what's in between furthering the story in enough of a way that suits the genre and that suits what reader expectations are and conventions. Just because I like it, is it going to make the story work?
Right.
So I think it is tricky because that's when an editor's really useful, where they read it and they say, well, you've got all this information about, how they end up, equipping the spaceship and, fixing up the drive that wasn't working and all of that. And that's all really interesting to some geeks, but maybe 95% of the readers are just going to want to know, look, the battle is coming and we want to get there.
Right. And the tricky thing for us as writers is that explaining to the reader how the hyperdrive was repaired, or, whatever you want to call it, might be critical setup to the story. It might be necessary to advance your plot. And so that's where writers can get a little blind to what's going on because they know this is necessary for later. So they focus on it and do due diligence, getting that scene on the page before the reader, but they don't realize that that's not that interesting a piece of the story. So you need to find a way to get it in front of the reader, but make it interesting. So you need more happening than just the traveling, than just that factual, here's some information the reader must know.
Right. And on the flip side, you must not do what I always do, which is fill your manuscript with random stuff that seems cool at the time. Because I usually end up with a lot of bloat because I know that I need to get certain things in there, and I'm like, okay, but that's not interesting, so let's throw this in there and let's throw that in there because it's awesome, and let's throw this, and none of it ends up being part of a subplot or part of a character arc or part of an interact. I mean, it's just stuff. Right. And that's been my main problem, is figuring out what's the stuff that matters that can be put in there versus what's just stuff that's cluttering the manuscript and making the traveling more interesting.
Right.
But it's not actually interesting in the larger scope of the story.
Right. Well, let's talk about what can make the traveling more interesting, because I think there are a few different routes to go. And one of them, which can be legitimate if it's not overdone, is adding stuff like describing an interesting piece of setting or history while you're doing that informative piece of the story. So it might ultimately be window dressing, but it's that window dressing that gets the buyer into the store, right? So it's like the sugar that makes the medicine go down, so to speak. But how do you determine in revision which stuff you put in is a keeper and which you need to toss?
Most of my stuff just ends up being so sideways from the main anything that I realize rather quickly that it's just not even important. Thank you, Art. With a rhythm section in the background.
Yes,
sorry.
Very nice.
Yeah, I mostly just end up, especially because writing fantasy, you do end up with a lot of actual traveling. And I'm like, I have to cover so many days worth of actual movement of character from one place to another. And it just ends up being, let's just find something for them to do in this local village or this, place or whatever. And realistically, it's just bloat. It's just to pass the time. And it's pretty easy to figure that out once you are reading it back. So
Yeah. And in that case, the chapter break works wonders. just hop through time. Robert.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to that. I wonder if you went back through. I'll be curious about Kathryn's opinion on this as well when she comes back into the audio. As to if you were editing, say, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings today, how much of that would remain, or how much of it would go onto the cutting floor. Kathryn, I was just talking about Lord of the Rings. And as if you stood back and said, well, it's a massive road trip, and with a sort of serious action destination, and how much of that, I wonder these days, because a lot of people, I know I have a very good friend who mocks Tolkien sometimes. He deliberately writes these descriptions. Said, why use one word when you can use 2,000? And I wonder how much of that these days, if you were producing epic fantasy, would stay in a novel or would go to the cutting ring floor.
Again, it's a lot of it probably would stay in the more epic fantasies, because if you go back and look at like everywhere that they went, there's a lot of description, but that kind of speaks to the world building that exists within a fantasy. But like every place that they went gave you some piece of key information that they needed for later, or that would tie things back together. So it was, and that's the thing that I think makes the biggest difference, is whether or not your locations that you go to in a fantasy where you're actually traveling are important or not.
Right. And that.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Also, you've got that. If you look at the movies were also long, and you could argue that they did the reverse with The Hobbit, which is make the movies far too long for such a tiny book. But maybe a lot of people who were not book readers expected that it was another giant epic fantasy, so they had to kind of match it. Putting that aside, there were entire sections of Lord of the Rings that just never made it into the movie, and you think, well, okay, if you could tell the story without that, then why didn't he? Tom Bombadil, for example. There's a lot of things that just never made it to the movie, yet it still works. Mm-hmm. So I guess it depends. They're just two different stories. It's not a complaint. But I do agree with you, Kathryn, though, that everything that happens, it is a traveling book, if you like, mm-hmm. but mm-hmm. everywhere they go seems to have a point.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that is the key, that at every stop along the way, your protagonist gains some piece crucial mm-hmm. to the journey, and the Tolkien that is a Portal quest story. It's a classic example of one. And so in those stories, the setting functions as a key component of the world. So readers mm-hmm. of the story and the journey, so readers go to epic fantasy expecting the world building, expecting the experience of entering a different time and place. It's almost like going to historical fiction. You expect more than a cursory description of your surroundings mm-hmm. because they're so different, and readers go there because they want to vicariously visit that time.
Right. Which brings us back to what you were saying earlier, which is sometimes it's okay to use the setting, mm-hmm. right, and the world building to make whatever it is you're doing for that traveling more interesting, because it is fantastic, or it is, supernatural, or it's even historical, or someplace mm-hmm. that we necessarily wouldn't have access to otherwise, correct?
Right. And even if it were just a contemporary setting, you might be working with mood in that case. So you still mm-hmm. could bring in your setting, your narrative exposition and description of that place in order to make the travel, the information getting more interesting, and to make that moment in the story more relevant to the reader. So when we write, we're always playing games with our reader. We're always trying to manipulate their emotions by giving them this vicarious experience. So if your character is just sitting down flatly reading case files or flipping through, the card catalog at the library, what's your reader feeling, thinking, doing? Not much. So you need some other way to give your reader that journey. When your character's being kind of dull, bring something else into the reader's experience of your story there. And then, of course, another option is to make your character not be dull, even though the action is dull. So this is where subplots can really beef up a scene, a traveling scene.
Yeah, and if you've got sidekicks, then traveling scenes can be an opportunity for some dialogue that advances knowledge between characters, or mm-hmm. bounces ideas around.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In Silence of the Lambs, where they go on the aeroplane, and the FBI dude throws her the file, and so she has to look through the file, and it kind of updates the reader on what it is that they're dealing with, mm-hmm. While still making that interesting. So mm-hmm. it could just have been shoe leather, that it was a plane trip and they had some idle conversation, mm-hmm. but I don't think a good story ever does that. There is no idle conversation.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. There is no idle scene on the page, right? And that is the crux of the problem with these traveling chapters, is they feel idle. The car might as well be in park with the engine running and nobody's going anywhere.
Right.
So we need to cover that ground of information or movement without being dull.
Well, and I think this is where you get those books that have that feeling of like, oh my gosh, everything is happening all at once, right? Because you get that the character's getting hit on all sides. Mm-hmm. This is happening, and then at the same time this is happening, at the same time this is happening, because that way you can interplay, all of the different subplots or relationship issues,
right.
or character things back and forth as they're trying to hit that main through line. So, sometimes it can feel a little bit hectic, pacing-wise, depending on how the author's written it. But I think that's a really important thing to remember, is like they need to kind of be getting buffeted on all sides by different things, so they have those throughways to, where am I going now? Mm-hmm. You can pull something else. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as writers, we set our protagonist on this path to go, that straight through line, as you said, to get us through the main plot. And we just see that through line. But you have to think about the reality of people's lives. If your character is just one thing, your character's not well enough developed to be a protagonist, to be a point of view character. So your character has to be the hero, the parent, the child, the friend, the whatever roles and relationships make sense in that story. Just think about real life and how many different roles we all need to play in relationship to different people or different objectives, different hobbies, different etc. And so give your character enough of that so you can come at her from different angles, as you were saying, Kathryn, and keep throwing, throw trouble, throw fuel on the fire.
Right. And that can really help you up your tension too. Like if you're waiting for that hyperdrive to be fixed and the hyperdrive has to be fixed, right? And as a reader, you're like, as soon as that hyperdrive is fixed, like here it comes. Then every time that they get sidetracked, it like ratchets up that tension, right? When is the hyperdrive going to be fixed? We're delaying the hyperdrive. So.
Yep. Anytime you've got a ticking clock, I think then that adds to what you can do with a traveling scene.
Right, yeah, and pulling your character in multiple directions, so thinking of responsibilities like work and family and whatever other roles you assign to your character. You can have more than one thing in crisis mode at the same time to make sure that your character is confronting different issues. And then...
and they have to prioritize things, and in that moment, you're like, as a reader.
Yes. What are you? Yeah. So we've got subplots, we've got sidekicks or friends, supporting characters coming into the story. We've got world building and setting, kind of window dressing that scene. What are some other ways that we can get our character and our reader through traveling scenes smoothly?
We can always do the old movie trick and just jump cut.
Right. Except when we need the discovery of that information on the page.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that when you do revision, you can go back through and say, well, actually, do I need this particular part at all? And I've certainly done that. When you go, that's a waste. It's just a waste of words on the page. All I've done is I've built something into the plot just to make the traveling scene interesting, and actually it doesn't need to be there. It's the Tom Bombadil theory. So I know plenty of time, and I quite like books like that anyway, where all of a sudden you have to kind of work out in your mind what's happened in order for them to be in this scene, and you can. Because you're not silly, and you can work that out as you're reading. It doesn't necessarily stop you. And I've done it myself. But by the time we get to the fourth planet, we're pretty sure we're on the wrong track. So I don't have to give the whole thing about what they did on the previous three planets. They can talk about it amongst themselves if they want to. But but I want to know that this is not the first place they've stumbled on. They've had to do some significant exploration, or it's been 3 weeks since we found any remaining clue, so you can do those sort of things without feeling like you've got to explain to the reader.
Right. Yeah. So if you do go the jump cut route, you can use some narrative exposition or some dialogue to fill the reader in on that piece of discovery that you were trying to write in a scene that maybe failed.
Right. But what about when you need physical book space time to elapse? You know what I mean? Like you physically don't want point A and point B to be 1 page away from each other. Like you need that extra time, or you need your character to go and do and grow before they can encounter that information, right?
Right. So this is where subplots really come in handy, giving your character things they need to do that are essential, but maybe not directly related to the main plot, so those other roles your character has to fulfill? Or, can you think of some other main plot element that could happen chronologically between point A and point B in order to show the reader, more of that journey, whether physical or kind of metaphorical journey they're taking? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, something that takes them further away from their goal. So
yeah,
you think about it from that point of view of putting your character in the tree, then throwing stones at them, then setting the tree on fire idea. Then okay, so in your mind, in the plot, you need to get from A to B, but it's such a big leap that it's not going to make a lot of sense in the story. Then that probably means you need another tempo. I would say.
Yeah, and I think mistakes and accidents can come in handy too. Think about ways things can go wrong for your character that don't destroy your character's, progress, but can delay it or sidetrack it temporarily and are still interesting and relevant, but, create a detour in terms of that main plot through line. Other thoughts on traveling chapters or...
Well, I think that, I suppose if you look at it from a sort of micro level, every chapter, every scene is traveling something. It's traveling along the plot. The question is it relevant and is it advancing the story? And I suppose in that sense, that's going to give you the clue as to, well, am I just relating something here for the sake of time, or am I relating something here that's actually advancing the story or the character development that's interesting to the reader? And that might be a good barometer, I guess, to use.
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the word complicating, right? Is it complicating the main character's journey? And I think that if you're looking at everything through the lens of, is it important? I mean, sometimes you can put things in there that will become important because they are complicating the main character's journey from point A to point B. And so it, like we said earlier, can ratchet up the tension, can increase stakes, can increase relational issues, etc., to complicate ultimately what that main character has to do and go through in order to finalize, go through the climax and hit that resolution.
Right. Yeah. Complicating is a great way to look at it. Also, revealing is another great word to keep in mind. In my character book, when I talked about this, I used an excerpt from Judy K. Walker's Sidney Brennan novel, in which she had a scene where Sidney is like in a kind of a courthouse office type place, and she's looking at an evidence box and looking at a gun and from the evidence box and taking notes and just doing her work. And it was that classic example of, I need the reader to know Sidney made this discovery of information, right? So we're getting that leap from A to B that advances the story, but not enough else was happening. And the setting was good. There was nothing wrong with the scene. It just wasn't compelling. So the fix for that was to work with the character. And Sidney had some PTSD issues in this book. And so when she is there looking at the gun, I think there's a man across the room from her kind of eyeballing her weird or something. And there's the gun she's looking at. And the two combine to give her kind of a panic moment. So then the scene still does the work of traveling, of getting that information in front of the reader, but it becomes about more. It becomes about Sidney and her character's issue that she's struggling with through this book. So we go from just a basic plot scene to adding this layer of character arc, and that really makes the scene work.
And then something that can be used later on in the book as well. So, you know, if the
Right.
book is an internal arc about this particular character struggling with the PTSD and then finding a way through that or learning to live with it, then maybe that scene, they're still struggling with it. And then at a key moment in the story when it's going to put them in a life or death situation, they face a similar mirror scene, but then overcome it. So I think it's a lot of complexity and layering can be done in revision. You might find that in first draft you've written what could be just seen as a travelling scene, but then you can, as you say, Kathryn, you can complicate it, or you can stir in those extra layers, or add subplot, or there's an awful lot of things you can do. I think it sounds wrong, but to amp up that
right.
particular scene. But you've written the words and so you've channeled it in some way for a reason. So don't think you've necessarily, I've been quite brutal saying, oh yeah, we'll put it on the cutting room floor, but it might still serve a purpose. You might be able to do something with that.
Right. And I was thinking about that too. You almost sort of disguise the information gain there, right?
Yeah.
So the whole point of the scene, main plot-wise, right, is the information gain. But by layering in something else and turning the scene into being about the character, your reader might not even realize that they've been spoon-fed the information that they need for the climax.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's that sugar that makes the medicine go down. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Wait, did she find that gun? Oh, yeah.
All right. Wait, why was that gun important? Yeah. Cool. Well, at the end of the day, it's all about making every scene compelling. So don't be satisfied just to put some information in front of your character / reader. Do more with it. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.